Imagine the darkest night you have ever experienced. No moon, no stars visible through the thick tropical clouds. The air smells of gunpowder, salt water, and something far worse, burning steel and burning men. You are standing on the deck of a warship somewhere in the black waters of the Solomon Islands, and you have absolutely no idea whether the shadow moving toward you in the darkness is a friend or an enemy. You have seconds to decide. Seconds that will determine whether you live or die. Seconds that will determine whether the entire Pacific War tips one way or the other. This is not a scene from a Hollywood movie. This is the reality that thousands of American and Japanese sailors faced on the night of November 14th and into the early morning hours of November 15th, 1942, in one of the most brutal, chaotic, and decisive naval engagements ever fought on the open sea. This is the story of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and specifically, the extraordinary clash between two battleships that would echo through history forever, the USS Washington and the USS South Dakota, against the mighty Japanese battleship Congo-class Kirishima and her escort fleet. A battle fought almost entirely in pitch darkness, at ranges so close that some ships could see the faces of enemy sailors. A battle where radar technology met raw human courage, where command decisions made in fractions of seconds changed the course of World War II. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is one of the greatest and most underappreciated naval stories ever told. To understand why this battle matters so deeply, we have to go back several months. We have to understand what Guadalcanal meant, not just as a dot on a map in the South Pacific, but as a symbol, as a strategic prize, and as a killing ground that consumed men and machines on a scale that still staggers the imagination. In the summer of 1942, the war in the Pacific was at its most uncertain turning point. The Japanese Empire had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with terrifying speed and efficiency. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American battleship fleet. The Philippines had fallen. Wake Island had fallen. Singapore had fallen. For the first 6 months of 1942, it seemed like nothing could stop the Imperial Japanese war machine. Then came Midway in June of 1942, where American carrier forces, guided by brilliant code-breaking intelligence and fighting with extraordinary courage, sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day. Midway was the strategic turning point, but it did not end the fighting. It did not stop the Japanese advance. It simply changed the momentum slightly, and momentum in war is everything. The Japanese, despite their loss at Midway, were still an extraordinarily powerful force. They still controlled vast stretches of the Pacific. They still had battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and experienced crews that had been fighting and winning since 1937. The question after Midway was not whether Japan had been defeated, they had not, but whether the United States and her allies could seize the initiative and begin pushing back. That is where Guadalcanal comes in. In early July of 1942, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted something alarming on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, a large tropical island in the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 900 miles northwest of Australia. The Japanese were building an airfield. Now, to understand why this was so alarming, you have to understand geography and air power. An operational Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would put Japanese land-based aircraft within striking range of the vital supply lines connecting the United States to Australia. If those supply lines were cut, Australia could potentially be isolated, and the entire Allied position in the South Pacific could collapse. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations in Washington, saw the threat immediately. So did General Douglas MacArthur. The decision was made to strike before the airfield was completed. On the 7th of August, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal in the first American offensive land operation of the entire war. It was the beginning of what would become a 6-month campaign of almost incomprehensible ferocity. The Marines captured the unfinished airfield on the first day, and American engineers quickly completed it and named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. Henderson Field became the entire reason the campaign continued. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the air over Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled the air could protect their supply ships and attack the enemies. This was the essential logic of the campaign, and both sides understood it completely. The Japanese responded to the American landings with enormous force. They sent cruiser forces down from their major base at Rabaul, and in the Battle of Savo Island on the night of August 8th and 9th, they delivered one of the most devastating defeats in American naval history. 4 Allied cruisers were sunk in a matter of minutes, and the Japanese force withdrew virtually unscathed. It was a catastrophic blow to American naval prestige and a demonstration that Japanese night fighting tactics were superior to anything the Americans had yet encountered. But despite this disaster, the Marines clung to Henderson Field, and the campaign ground on. For the next 3 months, Guadalcanal became a meat grinder. By day, the Americans and their aircraft from Henderson Field ruled the waters around the island. By night, the Japanese ruled. Japanese destroyers and cruisers, moving so fast down the passage between the islands that the Americans nicknamed the route the Slot, made nightly runs to Guadalcanal to shell Henderson Field and deliver supplies and reinforcements. These runs were so regular and so effective that American sailors began calling them the Tokyo Express. The Tokyo Express was a serious problem. Japanese warships would race down the Slot after dark, shell Henderson Field with high explosive rounds powerful enough to crater the airstrip and destroy parked aircraft, land troops and supplies, and be gone before daylight returned American air superiority. It was a brilliantly executed strategy, and it was slowly bleeding the American position on the island. The Marines fighting in the jungle were heroic beyond description. They were fighting in 100-degree heat, in suffocating jungle humidity, against an enemy that had been trained to fight to the last man and who had no concept of surrender. They were suffering from malaria, dysentery, and a dozen other tropical diseases. They were running short of food, ammunition, and aircraft. General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marine forces on the island, sent increasingly desperate messages to his superiors. He needed more aircraft. He needed more supplies. He needed naval protection. And to provide that protection, the Navy had to fight at night in those narrow, island-studded waters, the exact conditions where the Japanese had proven they were deadly. The situation came to a head in early November of 1942. American intelligence indicated that the Japanese were preparing something much larger than the usual Tokyo Express runs. They were planning to send a major reinforcement convoy to Guadalcanal, escorted by powerful warships, including battleships. These battleships would bombard Henderson Field so heavily, and the Japanese had special high-explosive bombardment shells designed specifically for this purpose, that the airfield would be completely neutralized. Without air cover, the American supply ships would be at the mercy of Japanese naval forces. Without supplies, the Marines on the island would eventually be overwhelmed. The entire campaign, all those months of fighting and dying and bleeding, could unravel in a single night. The Americans knew it was coming. Their codebreakers and patrol aircraft had given them warning. Admiral William Halsey, who had taken command of the South Pacific area just weeks earlier with orders to be aggressive, made the decision to meet the Japanese threat head-on regardless of the odds. The man Halsey chose to lead the American naval response was Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan. Callahan was a respected officer, a former naval aide to President Roosevelt, a man known for his calm demeanor and personal courage. But he was given an almost impossible task with an inadequate force. His command consisted of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. Against this force, the Japanese were sending 2 battleships, the Hai and the Kirishima, along with a cruiser and 14 destroyers. This was not a fair fight by any mathematical calculation, but fair fights are a luxury that war rarely provides. On the night of November 12th and 13th of November, the first engagement of what we now call the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal erupted in the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound, the body of water between Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands that had already claimed so many ships that it had literally earned its grim nickname. Admiral Callahan led his force into the darkness in column, heading straight for the Japanese fleet. What followed was one of the most chaotic naval engagements in history. The two fleets became intermingled in the darkness at extremely close range. Ships were firing in all directions. At one point, American ships were firing on other American ships. The noise was beyond description. The thunder of guns, the shriek of shells, the crash of explosions, the screams of men. Admiral Callahan was killed. Admiral Norman Scott, who had actually been the hero of an earlier victory at Cape Esperance and who was sailing as second in command, was also killed. Both American admirals died in the chaos of that night action. The cruiser Atlanta was devastated by Japanese gunfire. But before he died, Callahan's sailors managed something extraordinary. They got in among the Japanese fleet so close, so tangled up with the enemy, that the Japanese battleships could not use their heavy guns effectively without risking hitting their own ships. And in the melee, the battleship Hai was struck by hundreds of shells, not heavy shells, because the American cruisers and destroyers didn't have guns powerful enough to penetrate battleship armor, but hundreds of smaller shells that wrecked her superstructure, killed her crew in enormous numbers, and damaged her steering. The Hai was left crippled and circling in Iron Bottom Sound as dawn came. American aircraft from Henderson Field, the very airfield she had come to destroy, found her and sank her. It was the first Japanese battleship lost in the war, but the cost to the Americans had been terrible. 7 ships sunk, hundreds of men dead, both admirals gone. But the Japanese mission had not been fully accomplished. Henderson Field had been damaged but not destroyed. And the Japanese were not done. On the night of November 13th and 14th, the cruiser Kinagasa and other Japanese warships came down to finish the job, bombarding Henderson Field again. Then, on November 14th, came the decisive phase. The massive Japanese reinforcement convoy, 11 transport ships carrying 13,000 troops and enormous quantities of supplies, began moving south toward Guadalcanal. And escorting that convoy, providing the protective muscle, was the battleship Kirishima, along with the heavy cruisers Otago and Takao, and numerous destroyers. Standing between this force and Guadalcanal, on orders from Admiral Halsey, who refused to let the Japanese have that night unopposed, was Task Force 64, commanded by Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee. And it is at this point that our story truly focuses, because Lee and his command were about to make history. Willis Lee was not the kind of admiral who looked the part in the Hollywood sense. He was heavy-set, wore thick-lensed glasses, and was known among his fellow officers for 2 things that might seem contradictory, but were actually perfectly complementary. He was perhaps the Navy's foremost expert on radar technology, and he was one of the most accurate rifle shots in the United States Navy, having won multiple gold medals in rifle shooting at the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, Belgium. Here was a man who understood both the cutting-edge technology of his era and the ancient, elemental skill of aiming and hitting a target under pressure. These 2 qualities, technological mastery and combat marksmanship, would prove decisive in the hours ahead. Lee's force was small but extraordinarily powerful for its composition. He had 2 battleships, his flagship, the USS Washington and the USS South Dakota. And he had 4 destroyers, the Walk, the Benham, the Preston, and the Gwen. That was it. 2 battleships and 4 destroyers against the oncoming Japanese force. The Washington was a North Carolina-class battleship commissioned just the previous year 1941. She was one of the newest, most modern warships in the American fleet. She displaced 37,000 tons and was armed with 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets. Those 16-inch guns could fire a shell weighing over 2,700 pounds at a target over 20 miles away. More importantly for this particular night, she was equipped with the latest American fire control radar, the Mark III, which could track targets in total darkness with precision that the human eye simply could not match. The South Dakota was also a new ship, a South Dakota-class battleship commissioned just months earlier in 1942. She was slightly smaller than the Washington, but similarly armed and capable. She too had radar fire control. Together, these two ships represented the cutting edge of American naval technology in 1942. As Lee's force approached Guadalcanal from the south on the evening of November 14th, the admiral was under no illusions about what awaited him. He knew the Japanese had battleships. He knew the Tokyo Express had been running for months, and that Japanese sailors were experienced night fighters. He knew his 4 destroyers were going into a situation where they were likely to face overwhelming force. And he knew that if he failed, if the Japanese convoy got through, the consequences for the men on Guadalcanal would be devastating. At approximately 10:30 in the evening on November 14th, Lee sent a radio message that has become one of the small, famous moments in the history of the Pacific War. He broadcast on a frequency he knew the Guadalcanal coastal radio station would be monitoring, trying to prevent any friendly fire incidents, and he identified himself in the most informal and direct possible way. He said, and these words carry the easy confidence of a man who has accepted what is coming. "Ike, Cactus, this is Lee. Tell your big boss Ching Lee is here and wants the Japanese to know it." Cactus was the code name for Guadalcanal. Ching Lee was the admiral's nickname, given to him by his sailors with genuine affection. The coastal radio operator, not recognizing Lee's call sign, responded with suspicion, asking who Ching Lee was. Lee's response was equally casual and direct. He told the operator not to worry about it and to just pass the word. In those few words, you can hear the character of the man. Cool, confident, unhurried, even as he was sailing toward one of the most dangerous nights of the entire war. What Lee did not know as his ships entered the narrow, island-studded waters of Iron Bottom Sound was that 3 of his 4 destroyers were already in serious danger. The Japanese force, which had detected American ships in the area, had also deployed their own destroyers in a screen ahead of their main force. In the darkness, the 2 forces were converging, and the American destroyers were heading directly into the teeth of the Japanese screen. The first contacts on Lee's radar came at approximately 2300 hours. The radar operators on the Washington, huddled over their glowing screens in the Combat Information Center deep inside the ship, reported contacts to the north. Lee studied the returns carefully. His radar could distinguish between the relatively small returns of destroyers and the massive returns of capital ships. He could see that there were multiple contacts, that they were moving fast, and that some of them were very large. He recognized that he was looking at the Japanese main force. Lee began maneuvering his ships, turning his battleships to bring his main battery to bear. But before the battleships could engage, the destroyers had their own battle to fight. The 4 American destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn, pushed ahead of the battleships, screening them from torpedo attack as doctrine required. But in doing so, they drove directly into a Japanese destroyer force that outnumbered them and that had already gained firing solutions. In a matter of terrifying minutes, the American destroyers were engulfed. The Walk was hit by a torpedo that detonated her forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic and instantaneous. Sailors who survived described a fireball that lit the entire sound for miles in every direction. The Walk sank in minutes. The Preston was hit multiple times by gunfire and torpedoes and also sank rapidly. The Benham took a torpedo hit that blew off a large section of her bow, but incredibly she remained afloat and eventually had to be scuttled the following day after it became clear she could not be saved. Only the Gwyn survived the initial engagement, though she too was damaged. In the span of perhaps 15 minutes, Lee had lost 3 of his 4 destroyers. The screen that was supposed to protect his battleships from torpedo attack was gone. His 2 great ships were now exposed, charging forward alone into a darkness full of enemies. This was the moment that would define the battle. The loss of the destroyers was a disaster, but it also had one effect that Lee could not have planned for. The explosions and fires from the sinking American ships lit up the area brilliantly, and in that sudden, hellish illumination, Japanese lookouts could see what they were dealing with. Japanese naval doctrine in 1942 was still heavily reliant on the Mark I eyeball, the skilled human lookout, the night binoculars, the experienced eye trained to pick shapes out of darkness. Japanese lookouts were genuinely among the best in the world at this task. They had trained obsessively for night combat because they knew that night, with its equalizing effect on the disparity in air power between the 2 sides, was their best opportunity. But now, with fires burning and ships exploding, the Japanese lookouts spotted the unmistakable silhouettes of battleships. Big ships. American battleships. This changed everything for the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, who was in overall command of the Japanese force. Kondo's primary mission was to escort the transports to Guadalcanal and to bombard Henderson Field with Kiroshima's bombardment shells. He had not expected to encounter American battleships. The intelligence picture had not indicated battleships were in the area. Kondo had to make a rapid decision: press on with the mission as planned, or deal with the threat that Lee's battleships represented. He chose to fight. He ordered his heavy cruisers and destroyers forward to engage, and the Kirishima began preparing her main battery. Meanwhile, on the Washington's bridge, Lee was watching the radar picture with the eyes of a man who had spent years learning to read exactly this kind of information. His radar showed him multiple contacts, destroyers, cruisers, and the massive return of at least 1 battleship. He knew his destroyers were gone. He knew he was essentially alone with his 2 battleships. What he did next demonstrated the kind of tactical clarity that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. Lee turned Washington and South Dakota so that their main batteries would bear on the Japanese force and opened fire. The 16-inch guns of the Washington began speaking. Each time they fired, the concussion was so powerful that it could be felt in every part of the ship, every bone of every man aboard. The muzzle flash was so bright that it briefly turned night into day for miles around. And the shells, each one weighing more than a ton, were traveling over 2,000 feet per second toward targets that Lee's radar was tracking with mechanical precision. Lee was not shooting by human eyesight. He was shooting by radar. His fire control radar was computing the range, bearing, and movement of the target, calculating the lead angle, accounting for the speed of his own ship, and generating firing solutions that were fed directly to the guns. This was something entirely new in naval warfare. Battleships had never before fought at night using radar-directed main battery fire at long range with this degree of effectiveness. Lee was writing the tactical playbook in real time as the battle unfolded. The South Dakota, following behind the Washington, had her own problems. In the chaos of the destroyer battle and the subsequent maneuvering, she had suffered a series of electrical failures. The exact cause has been debated by historians ever since, but the effect was devastating. Her radar went offline. Her fire control systems were disrupted. In the darkness, without radar, the South Dakota was fighting blind. And worse, the fires from the burning destroyers silhouetted her perfectly for Japanese gunners. The Japanese cruisers Atago and Takao, along with the Kirishima and numerous destroyers, concentrated their fire on the South Dakota. She was struck by at least 26 large-caliber shells, possibly more, in a matter of minutes. Shells hit her forward turrets, her superstructure, her radar equipment, her fire control director. Men were killed throughout the ship. Damage control parties worked desperately to keep her fighting. The captain, Thomas Gatch, was wounded by flying steel on his bridge. Yet the South Dakota, absorbing punishment that would have sunk most ships, stayed afloat and stayed in the fight. Her main battery continued firing, her crew fighting with the kind of desperate, determined courage that has no tactical manual but is the essential ingredient in victory. The Japanese shells, while they caused enormous damage to the South Dakota superstructure and killed many of her crew, did not penetrate her main armor belt. Battleship armor is specifically designed to resist exactly this kind of fire, and in this case, it did its job. But while the South Dakota was absorbing the concentrated fire of most of the Japanese force, something was happening on the other side of the battle that would prove decisive. The Washington, operating in the darkness at some distance from the South Dakota, had been tracking the Kirishima with her fire control radar. The Washington's radar operators had maintained contact with the Japanese battleship throughout the chaos of the fight. Now, with the Japanese guns concentrated on the South Dakota, the Washington had what every gunnery officer dreams of: a target that doesn't know it's being aimed at. Lee ordered his main battery to engage the Kirishima. The Washington's 9 16-inch guns trained out to the target bearing that the radar had provided. The fire control computer generated the solution, and then the guns fired. The effect was catastrophic. Washington fired approximately 75 16-inch shells at the Kirishima over a period of roughly 7 minutes. Of those 75 shells, somewhere between 20 and 40 struck the target. The exact number has never been definitively established, but the damage they caused was beyond dispute. Each 16-inch shell that struck the Kirishima detonated with the energy of a small bomb. They penetrated her deck armor. They wrecked her turrets. They started fires that spread rapidly through her hull. They flooded her compartments. They wrecked her steering. They killed her crew by the hundreds. The Kirishima, a veteran warship that had survived the earlier fighting on November 13th and had sailed through half the war without serious damage, was dying. The transformation that came over the battle in those 7 minutes was extraordinary. The Japanese force, which had been pounding the South Dakota with apparent dominance, suddenly found itself confronted with a new and terrible reality. The Washington was out there in the darkness, and she had found their battleship, and she was killing it with a methodical, radar-directed precision that Japanese naval doctrine had never anticipated. Kondo ordered his force to concentrate on finding and destroying the Washington, but Lee was maneuvering his ship constantly, changing course and speed to prevent the Japanese from gaining a stable fire solution. Without radar guidance of their own for night fighting, the Japanese ships were shooting at a ship they could not reliably locate. Their fire was heavy but largely ineffective against the Washington. A few shells came close. A few fragments hit the ship, but the Washington was not seriously damaged. She continued firing, continued maneuvering, continued hunting. Her radar eyes saw everything. The Kirishima was now completely unmanageable. Her steering was gone, and she was turning in circles, a terrible and helpless condition for a warship in combat. Her crew was fighting catastrophic flooding. Her fires were spreading to her magazines, which posed the ultimate danger of a massive explosion that would kill everyone aboard in an instant. Vice Admiral Kondo made the decision that every admiral in his position dreads, but that duty and the preservation of his remaining force required. He ordered the general retirement of his force northward, away from Guadalcanal. The transports, the convoy that had been the whole reason for this operation, would not reach Guadalcanal. Henderson Field would not be bombarded into neutrality. The Tokyo Express had been stopped, not by a crippling of Japanese will, but by the radar-guided guns of a single American battleship fighting in the darkness. As the Japanese force withdrew, 2 Japanese destroyers came alongside the Kirishima to take off her crew. The battleship was beyond saving. Her flooding was unstoppable, her fires were beyond control, and her structural integrity was failing. Somewhere around 2 in the morning on November 15, 1942, the Kirishima capsized and sank in the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, taking hundreds of her crew down with her. She was the second Japanese battleship to be sunk in the war, following her sister ship the Hai, sunk just days before in the same waters. 2 Japanese battleships lost in 3 days in the same narrow stretch of ocean. It was a catastrophe for Japanese naval prestige that could not be concealed. But the battle was not entirely over, and its consequences continued to unfold through the daylight hours of November 15th. The Japanese transport convoy, deprived of its battleship escort and facing American air power from Henderson Field, was decimated. American aircraft, Army, Navy, and Marine flyers operating from the recently reinforced Henderson Field struck the convoy relentlessly throughout the day. Of the 11 transport ships, 7 were sunk before they reached Guadalcanal. The remaining 4 ran themselves aground on the beaches of Guadalcanal rather than attempting to turn back under air attack, and they were subsequently destroyed by American warships and aircraft while still beached. Of the 13,000 troops and the enormous quantities of supplies they had been carrying, only a fraction reached the island, and much of that was lost when the beached ships were destroyed. The Japanese reinforcement effort, which had been intended to tip the balance of the campaign decisively in Japan's favor, had essentially failed completely. The significance of what had happened took time to become fully clear, but it was immense. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 3 days and 2 nights from November 12th through 15th, was a strategic turning point in the Pacific War, even more significant than the tactical turning point of Midway. Midway had stopped Japanese expansion. Guadalcanal had begun the long, bloody process of rolling it back. After November 15, 1942, the Japanese never again attempted a major naval bombardment of Henderson Field with capital ships. The Tokyo Express continued running for several more months, but it was delivering supplies in drums dropped offshore, not troops and artillery in organized convoy. It was the difference between a supply trickle and the flood that had been needed to reinforce Guadalcanal properly. The Japanese High Command, recognizing that the campaign was lost, eventually made the agonizing decision to evacuate their remaining forces from Guadalcanal in early February of 1943. The evacuation was brilliantly executed, successfully removing most of the surviving Japanese troops, but it was still a retreat, and everyone on both sides knew it. Guadalcanal was the first major Japanese strategic defeat of the ground war, and the naval battle of Guadalcanal was the naval engagement that made that defeat inevitable. For the men who fought in those black waters, the human cost was staggering. The Americans lost 7 ships sunk and several more heavily damaged. Hundreds of sailors died. The South Dakota, despite absorbing extraordinary punishment, made it back to base and was eventually repaired and returned to service. Her crew had fought with heroism that deserved far more recognition than it received, overshadowed as it was by the Washington's spectacular gunnery performance. The Washington herself emerged from the battle with only minor damage, a testament to Lee's tactical skill in keeping his ship mobile and the Japanese inability to achieve accurate fire control without radar in the darkness. Lee himself was awarded the Navy Cross for his conduct in the battle, but like many of the men who fought at Guadalcanal, he never fully received the fame that his achievement warranted. He remained a working admiral, continuing to serve throughout the rest of the war with distinction, and died in 1945, the same year the war ended, at the relatively young age of 54. Admiral Kondo survived the war and wrote extensively about the Battle of Guadalcanal from the Japanese perspective. His accounts are fascinating because they reveal how completely the battle had disrupted Japanese assumptions and planning. Kondo was a skilled and experienced officer, but he had been sent into a situation where the technological advantage had shifted decisively against him in ways he had not been fully prepared for. The Japanese Navy had dominated night fighting for the first year of the Pacific War, partly through superior training, partly through their deadly long lance torpedoes, which were faster and more powerful than any American torpedo, and partly through an institutional confidence in their night combat doctrine that bred an aggressive boldness in their commanders. What happened on the night of November 14th and 15th revealed the limits of that doctrine against an enemy who had developed radar fire control to a degree the Japanese had not matched. The Japanese would eventually develop their own radar capabilities, but by then the momentum of the war had shifted irrevocably. The long lance torpedo deserves its own moment of discussion here, because it was one of the genuinely war-deciding weapons of the early Pacific War. The Type 93 torpedo, known to the Allies as the Long Lance, was an oxygen-powered torpedo with a range and speed that no American torpedo could match. Where American torpedoes typically ran for perhaps 5 miles at reduced speed or 3 miles at full speed, the Long Lance could travel 22 miles at 49 knots or 42 miles at 36 knots. It carried a warhead of almost half a ton of explosives. American warships had been sunk repeatedly by this weapon at ranges they had never imagined possible. At Savo Island, at Tassafaronga, at Kalimbangara, and other night engagements, the Long Lance had extracted a terrible price from American naval forces. On the night of November 14th and 15th, it was the Long Lance that sank the American destroyers in the opening phase of the battle. And yet, despite its fearsome reputation, the Long Lance could not save the Kirishima from radar-directed 16-inch shells in the darkness. Technology had met technology, and on that particular night, American radar technology had proven decisive. The story of the Battle of Guadalcanal cannot be told without acknowledging the extraordinary roles played by forces operating from Henderson Field itself. The airmen of the Cactus Air Force, as the mixed Army, Navy, and Marine aviation contingent based at Henderson Field had come to call themselves, had been fighting under terrible conditions for months. They were flying aircraft that were often in desperate need of maintenance. They were living in primitive conditions, constantly shelled and bombed. They were losing pilots faster than replacements could arrive. And yet they kept flying. They kept fighting. They sank the High with repeated air attacks on November 13th. They devastated the Japanese convoy on November 15th. Without them, even Lee's victory in the night battle might not have been enough to stop the Japanese resupply effort completely. The Battle of Guadalcanal was a joint effort in the truest sense. Ground forces, air forces, and naval forces all contributing to a common result that none could have achieved alone. The Japanese sailors and soldiers who fought and died at Guadalcanal deserve recognition as well. The Japanese Navy that fought this campaign was not a brutal occupying force in the same sense as the Japanese Army on the Asian mainland. These were professional sailors, many of them trained and experienced, who fought with extraordinary skill and courage throughout the campaign. The crews of the High and the Kirishima fought their ships to the last, staying at their posts as their ships sank beneath them. The destroyermen who made the Tokyo Express runs night after night down the slot, under constant threat of air attack by day and naval ambush by night, displayed a tenacity and professionalism that commands respect regardless of the political and moral framework of the war they were serving. History is always more complex than simple narratives of good versus evil, and the sailors on both sides of Iron Bottom Sound in November 1942 were primarily men doing their duty under conditions of extreme danger and hardship. The island of Guadalcanal itself bears the physical scars of the campaign to this day. Iron Bottom Sound, the name given to the body of water between Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands, earned its name through the campaign. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 40 and 50 ships, both American and Japanese, lie on the bottom of that sound, a vast, silent graveyard of steel and history. The remains of American sailors who went down with their ships rest there still, in what has been designated an official war grave. Divers who have visited the wrecks describe the experience as profoundly moving. The hulls encrusted with coral, inhabited by fish, gradually becoming part of the reef ecosystem, but still recognizable as the warships they once were. The gun turrets of the USS Atlanta, sunk in the first night's action, still point toward the surface from the bottom of the sound. The High lies somewhere in those waters, though her exact position has never been definitively established. The destroyers, the cruisers, the transports, all of them are there, the physical residue of one of the most intense naval campaigns in history. What does the Battle of Guadalcanal, and specifically the night action of November 14th and 15th, tell us about the nature of warfare and the factors that determine victory? There are several lessons that military historians and strategists have drawn from it in the decades since. The first is the critical importance of technological advantage, properly exploited. Lee's radar gave him the ability to engage the enemy effectively in conditions where the traditional Japanese advantage in night fighting was neutralized. But technology alone does not win battles. It has to be understood, trusted, and used correctly by commanders who have prepared themselves to exploit it. Lee spent years studying radar, arguing for its development and deployment, and training himself and his crews to use it as a primary tactical tool rather than a backup to visual observation. His preparation paid off in 7 minutes of accurate fire that destroyed a Japanese battleship. The second lesson is the decisive importance of command decision-making under uncertainty and pressure. Lee made his key decisions: when to open fire, how to maneuver, when to continue engaging, and when to withdraw, in real time, with incomplete information, under fire, in total darkness. Each decision was correct. The third lesson, perhaps the most sobering, is the relationship between tactical success and strategic context. Lee's tactical victory was brilliant, but it mattered only because the broader strategic context, the defense of Henderson Field, the supply of the Marines on the ground, the holding of Guadalcanal, gave it meaning. Tactical victories divorced from strategic purpose are ultimately meaningless. The legacy of the naval battle of Guadalcanal in American naval doctrine was profound and lasting. The battle demonstrated conclusively that radar-directed gunnery could be decisive in night combat. It accelerated the development and deployment of fire control radar throughout the fleet. It influenced the design of subsequent American warships. And it fundamentally changed how the United States Navy approached night combat doctrine. After Guadalcanal, American ships continued to improve their radar capabilities, and the Japanese advantage in night combat that had been so deadly in the first year of the war was progressively eroded. By 1944 and 1945, American ships were consistently outperforming Japanese opponents in night engagements, a reversal that would have seemed almost impossible to the men who had survived Savo Island in August 1942. The trajectory from Savo Island to Surigao Strait, where American forces annihilated a Japanese battleship force in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history in October 1944, runs directly through the waters of Iron Bottom Sound in November 1942. For Admiral Willis Lee personally, the battle represented the culmination of a career spent preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Lee was not a glamorous figure in the public consciousness of the war. He did not have the theatrical presence of Halsey or the stern charisma of Spruance. He was a quiet, intellectual officer who preferred the technical over the theatrical. But in the critical moment, when Halsey needed someone he could trust to take two battleships into an impossible situation against a superior Japanese force and fight them correctly, he chose Lee. And Lee delivered results that exceeded any reasonable expectation. There is a quality in great commanders that is difficult to name precisely. It is something like the ability to remain calm and analytically clear in conditions that reduce most men to reactive, emotional decision-making. Lee had that quality in abundance. His radio message, "Ching Lee is here and wants the Japanese to know it," was not bravado. It was the calm, almost amused statement of a man who had done his preparation, trusted his technology, trusted his crew, and was ready for whatever the night would bring. The men who served under Lee on the Washington that night remembered it for the rest of their lives. Veterans who spoke about the battle in the decades after the war consistently described the same quality of experience. The extraordinary noise, the terrifying beauty of the gun flashes, the sense of helplessness, and then, as the radar-guided fire began finding its targets, a growing, almost incredulous realization that they were winning. Gunners' mates who worked in the turrets loading shells that weighed more than a large man, rammer men, powder handlers, fire control technicians watching their radar screens. All of them contributed to those 75 16-inch rounds that destroyed the Hiroshima. War is ultimately a human endeavor, and the machines are only as effective as the humans operating them. The Washington's crew, trained to a peak of efficiency and trusting in their technology and their commander, performed at exactly the level that the moment demanded. The Japanese survivors of the battle carried their memories across 6 more decades of life. Survivors of the Hiroshima, rescued from the waters of Iron Bottom Sound by Japanese destroyers, went on to serve in other warships, some of them surviving the entire war, others dying in subsequent actions. The Japanese Navy as an institution absorbed the lessons of Guadalcanal slowly and incompletely. The institutional culture that had created such excellence in night fighting was slow to accept that its fundamental tactical assumptions had been invalidated by American radar technology. This institutional conservatism, this resistance to changing doctrine in the face of evidence, contributed to subsequent defeats. The Americans, more flexible doctrinally and backed by an industrial base of almost incomprehensible scale, continued to improve at a rate the Japanese simply could not match. The broader context of the Guadalcanal campaign, those 6 months from August 1942 to February 1943, is essential to understanding the true magnitude of what was at stake in those waters. The campaign cost the United States Navy 24 warships sunk and many more heavily damaged. It cost the Japanese Navy 24 warships as well, a remarkable symmetry in losses that underscores how closely matched the two sides were throughout the campaign. On the ground, the Marine and Army forces fighting in the jungle paid a terrible price. Thousands killed, thousands more incapacitated by disease. The Japanese Army losses were even worse, with the majority of the Japanese troops committed to the island dying not in battle, but from starvation and disease, as the American naval victories progressively cut off their supply lines. The total cost of the campaign on both sides, in ships, aircraft, and men, was enormous. But for the Americans, those losses were replaceable. For the Japanese, they were not. Japan's industrial base, despite its remarkable achievements in the first years of the war, simply could not produce ships, aircraft, and trained crews at the rate that American industry could. Every Japanese loss at Guadalcanal was irreplaceable in a way that American losses, painful as they were, simply were not. This asymmetry in production capacity was perhaps the deepest reason for Japan's ultimate defeat, but it was not apparent in late 1942. The outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign was genuinely uncertain throughout most of its duration. There were moments, the loss of carriers at Savo Island, the destruction of the destroyers in the first night action of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, when an objective observer might have concluded that the Japanese would ultimately prevail. What prevented that outcome was a combination of factors: the extraordinary fighting quality of the American Marines on the ground, the tenacity of the Cactus Air Force pilots, the aggressive determination of Admiral Halsey's command philosophy, the skill and preparation of Willis Lee, and the technological edge provided by American radar. None of these factors alone was decisive. Together, they were irresistible. Looking at the battle from the Japanese perspective one more time, it is worth considering what might have been different. If the Japanese High Command had committed their full remaining carrier force to the Guadalcanal campaign rather than holding it back for a decisive engagement that never came, the outcome might have been different. If Japanese naval radar development had kept pace with American developments, Lee's advantage on the night of November 14th might have been neutralized. If the Kirishima and Hai had bombarded Henderson Field effectively enough to put it out of action for an extended period, the daylight battle against the convoy on November 15th could not have happened as it did. War is full of such contingencies, and the student of history is always wise to consider the paths not taken as well as the path that events actually followed. But history gives us only what happened, not what might have happened, and what happened was decisive. The name Iron Bottom Sound carries within it the weight of all those ships and all those men. 40 or more warships resting on the floor of that tropical sound, their hulls gradually becoming artificial reefs. Their crews remain scattered by the currents of decades. American and Japanese, they share those waters in a way they never shared anything in life. The Walk and the Preston sunk in the opening minutes of Lee's battle. The Kirishima and the Hai, the great battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Atlanta and her consorts from the first night's action. All of them there together, in the darkness beneath those blue tropical waters, while above them the island of Guadalcanal exists today as the nation of the Solomon Islands. Its people going about their lives in the shadow of an event that most of the world has largely forgotten, but that shaped the modern Pacific world entirely. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, the night action of November 14th and 15th, and the brilliant performance of Admiral Willis Lee and the crew of the USS Washington deserve to be remembered not merely as military history, but as a story about what human beings can accomplish when preparation meets crisis, when technology is understood and trusted rather than feared or ignored, and when the men and women on whom everything depends find in themselves the courage and competence that the moment requires. Lee sailed 2 battleships into the darkness against a superior Japanese force because Halsey asked him to, and because the men on the ground needed him to. He fought that battle with every resource of skill, training, technology, and nerve that he possessed. He won. And because he won, Guadalcanal held. And because Guadalcanal held, the long road back across the Pacific began in earnest. And because that road was traveled, the world we live in today came to be. The connection between those 7 minutes of radar-directed gunfire in November 1942 and the world as it exists in the 21st century is real, even if it is invisible to most people most of the time. That is the true measure of why this battle matters. That is why the story of Washington and Lee deserves to be told and retold and remembered. So now, after all that, after the darkness and the gun flashes and the radar screens and the sinking ships and the dying men, let me ask you this question, and I want you to think about it seriously. If you had been in Admiral Lee's position on that November night, commanding 2 battleships and 4 destroyers against a superior Japanese force, with the outcome of the entire Guadalcanal campaign depending on your decisions, knowing that your destroyers were being annihilated in the opening minutes, knowing that your second battleship had gone partially blind from electrical failure, knowing that the enemy had your fleet concentrated in their sights, would you have kept fighting? Or is there a point at which no amount of training, no amount of preparation, No amount of radar technology is enough to justify continuing. Lee kept fighting. He won, but the outcome was never certain. Think about that. Think about the weight of command, the weight of decision, the weight of those 7 minutes in the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. And if this story moved you, if it made you see the Pacific War a little differently, share it with someone who loves history, because stories like this one, stories of real men in real darkness making decisions that changed the world, are the reason history deserves to be studied and remembered. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments below, what night battle in naval history do you think deserves more attention than it gets? I'll be reading every single one.